Let's continue with our read aloud of what is the civil rights movement. Chapter 9, Selma to Montgomery. Alabama was not much better than Mississippi when it came to letting Black people vote. The SCLC and SNCC decided to lead a series of protest marches in Selma, Alabama. They would ask TV news stations to cover the march. Any violence caught on camera might gain support for voters' rights. On January 18, 1965, Dr. King and John Lewis began leading marches to the Selma courthouse. After a week of protest, the local sheriff beat a Black woman in full view of the cameras. Dr. King was arrested for having led the protest. In a letter published in the New York Times newspaper, he said, "There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls." Nearly 3 weeks later, a civil rights activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed by state police. He'd been trying to stop them from beating his mother. To honor Jackson's life, the demonstrators planned a 54-mile march from Selma to the steps of the state capitol building in Montgomery. The walk would take 5 days and risk lives. It was a chance most protesters were willing to take. And here's Jimmy Lee Jackson. On Sunday, March 7th, John Lewis and members of the SCLC led over 500 people in a peaceful march from Brown Chapel in Selma to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Sorry. They crossed the muddy waters of the Alabama River to face a terrifying sight. White policemen in helmets and blue uniforms stood waiting on the other side with nightsticks. They had been sent by Alabama's Governor George Wallace. Alabama State Police Major John Cloud shouted at the protesters through a bullhorn, "You will not be allowed to march any further." The protesters stood their ground and the police attacked. John Lewis's skull was fractured. 5 women were beaten unconscious. Marchers hid under cars or scrambled down the riverbank. They were chased all the way back to Brown Chapel. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. The violence shocked the world. On March 21st, over 3,000 Black and white protesters set out once again. They included children and the grandfather of Jimmy Lee Jackson. One white protester named Jim Leatherer had only one leg. He planned to walk all 54 miles on crutches. With news cameras rolling, the protesters crossed the bridge. Angry white people lined the path of the march like it was a parade. They shouted insults and held signs telling the marchers to go home. But the protest went on. The marchers walked up to 16 miles a day. Along the way, they were joined by celebrities and other supporters. Their numbers eventually grew to 25,000 people. On the last night of the march, they held a concert. The next morning, the marchers reached the steps of the state capitol. They demanded their voting rights, but George Wallace refused to see them. Still, the march was a success. The world had been watching. President Lyndon B. Johnson knew the time had come to show that he was on the side of civil rights. John Lewis and Dr. King were there when the president signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. The new act made it illegal to give voters literacy tests. The federal government would investigate poll taxes and pay special attention to areas where hardly any voters were people of color. Black voices would no longer be ignored thanks to the Selma to Montgomery March. The promises first made by the Civil Rights Act of 1870 had finally been kept. This is Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act. And there's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Chapter 10, Changing Times. Black Power became a rallying cry from civil rights activists in the 1960s. A man named Stokely Carmichael made the phrase popular. He described it as a call for Black people in this country to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community. Black Power focused on people having pride in their African heritage. Natural hair and African style clothing became fashionable. But like Black nationalism, Black power encouraged Black people to live separately from white people. In 1966, Black power gave rise to the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers took their name from a group in Alabama whose goal was to get Black people elected into office. They'd chosen a Black Panther for their logo because it was the opposite of the white rooster logo used by the all-white Alabama Democratic Party. The Black Panthers originally began in order to protect Black people from police brutality. The Panthers also offered free breakfast to children, as well as health and education services to Black communities across the country. But the Black Panthers were different from other civil rights groups. They carried guns for protection and had trouble with the FBI. They did not agree with the nonviolent teachings of Dr. King. Black Panther Party founders Bobby Seale left and Huey Newton. Much of the civil rights movement had been focused on the South. Discrimination in the rest of the country often went unnoticed until poor neighborhoods erupted in violence. This was the case in a Black neighborhood called Watts in Los Angeles, California. August 1965 marked 6 days of violence known as the Watts riots. Violence also broke out in northern cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit. Dr. King and the SCLC organized more peaceful protests, but none truly succeeded. In 1966, they launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, which worked with Operation Breadbasket to feed the poor. But discrimination in the North could be as difficult to overcome as it was in the South. That same year, James Meredith attempted a march against fear. Meredith was the man who had desegregated Ole Miss. Just 2 days into the walk, he was shot and wounded by a white man. James Meredith is wounded during his march against fear. Organizers were determined to continue the march, but people like Stokely Carmichael were tired of the nonviolent approach. Carmichael called out Black power during the protest. The civil rights movement was becoming more extreme and more divided. Then in April 1968, an event shook the entire country. Dr. King had gone to Memphis, Tennessee in support of garbage collectors who demanded safer working conditions. On April 3rd, Dr. King gave a moving speech. He talked about his own death. There had been threats on his life, but he had always ignored them. In this speech, he said that God had allowed him to go to the mountaintop and see the promised land. The promised land meant a peaceful world of Black and white people living together. I may not get there with you, he told the crowd, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. The next evening, Dr. King was shot and killed on the balcony of his hotel. The assassin was a white man named James Earl Ray. Riots broke out across the country. The dream Dr. King had lived and died for was in danger of falling apart, and there was still a long way to go. Unfortunately, progress is not always fast or easy. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first African American president of the United States. This was something that many Americans had hoped for, but few believed they would live to see. The 2008 election seemed to promise the dawn of a new age of equality. Indeed, there are now more people of color in government and running major companies than ever before. The inauguration of Barack Obama in 2009. Some people thought this meant racism no longer existed, but it does. In the United States, people of color are still punished more severely by the law than white people. They are given much longer jail sentences for the same kind of offenses, and Black people are still paid less for the same work. In 2013, the Supreme Court overturned part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Some southern states immediately changed their laws to make it harder for people of color to vote, and white supremacy, the belief that white people are better than any other race, is on the rise. In Charlottesville, Virginia, in 2017, white supremacists marched while carrying torches and rifles and shouting racist slogans. But peaceful marches also continue. When a Black man named George Floyd was killed by police in 2020, the world rose up against it. Black Lives Matter marches were held worldwide to protest police brutality and the killing of African American men, women, and children. Many other minority groups still march to have their voices heard. As Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's wife, said, freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. And so the people march on. And then here is your timeline for the civil rights movement. And I want to mention that John Lewis, one of those activists, went on to become a member of our government. So he continued in his fight for equality and freedom until he passed away.